Casting with Ceri Jones.
Today's episode, I travelled down to Pembrokeshire to meet up with Tony Davies. I have known Tony for over 25 years, then he was manager of Llysaran Reservoir and Country Park. He shares with us his stories and experience in work with Hyder and Welsh Water in his role of transforming reservoir trout fishing in Wales. He also tells us about his stories as a child fishing with his father in the Dyfi Valley, plus the importance of having ladies in fly fishing, and onto his concerns for his beloved rivers of West Wales. So sit back and enjoy as I chat with Tony at his home, also his Springer Spaniel, Elsie. Well, hello Tony. Thank you for inviting me down to your lovely home in West Wales. It's hard to believe on days like this. We've just come out of lockdown and I'm in this conservatory, which is like roasting, a beautiful location, a bit different to my studio, which is no windows back home. So if you can hear any noises in the back, we got, what's your dog called again?
Elsie.
Elsie. Yeah. And she's how old?
Oh, she's about 1.5 years, Ceri.
Is it?
Yeah, she's not trained as she should be. Not trained as she should be, but she's
beautiful.
Lovely. Great with the family, good with the grandchildren.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Have you had a chance to get out fishing since lockdown?
Yes, it was very frustrating, wasn't it, early on when, in Wales, of course, the Welsh government were in charge of the lockdown and we were anticipating being allowed to go fishing.
Yeah.
And of course, they were cautious, quite rightly, I think. And we had this 5-mile limit, didn't we? Which was a bit of a joke, to be honest, down here in Pembrokeshire.
Yeah.
I mean, most of us, the nearest fishery is at least 10 miles away.
Yeah.
But eventually we were allowed out and great relief to get out, to be honest with you.
It's good for the soul as well, isn't it?
Oh, tremendous. I mean, the first time I went out, my wife, I think, was glad to get rid of me, to be honest. She'd had enough. She'd had enough. And she said, are you going fishing?
Good job, you got a big house.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, she'd stick me out in the greenhouse and said, keep gardening, But I couldn't wait to go. And fortunately, a couple of friends, we fish on Rosebush. You know Rosebush, don't you? Wild Brown Reservoir. Lovely little place on the Brazili Hills. And we were itching to go. And the first day out, I came back. I think we caught a few fish.
Yeah.
Came back home. And I went out like a light. Totally relaxed. Fast asleep for 3 hours. Early evening. Which again was lovely for my wife.
Yeah.
I mean, it totally relaxed me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're the same, So many of us fly fishermen in particular. It's part of your makeup, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's part of your DNA to go fishing.
Yeah. I'm funny you saying that, actually, about being tired, because the first couple of times I went, thinking, I'm going to fish for the day, After like 3 hours, I was tired.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's because you're not used to it, being outdoors in the fresh air and walking.
And it's not just catching fish, you know this. You suddenly look around and you remember what a beautiful place it is you go fishing in.
Yeah.
Nearly all our wild brown, particularly wild brown trout, and let's be fair, many of the rainbow fisheries with stocked reservoirs are beautiful places to be.
Yeah.
And you look around and you suddenly appreciate, as a fisherman, everything about you. You listen to the cuckoo, you see the swallows on the water, and you remember these things that you've missed, which you took for granted in the previous years.
Yeah.
And it brings it all back to you. And you can almost feel your heart rate dropping back to a sensible level because you're doing the thing you love doing.
Some sort of normality.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, a lot of our families and friends would say, you're all fanatics, you fishermen, Fishing, yes, you have to concentrate fly fishing, what you're doing. But I found myself fishing for 20 minutes, maybe at my age, I've got in a tangle again. First time out, got to be accepted, hasn't it?
I've been doing that lately.
Yeah, I mean, honestly. And then I've got my glasses on and I'm trying to change the fly or the knot. And then a grebe came up by the boat. Now, 10 years ago, I was so fanatical. I wouldn't have watched the grebe. But this time I just relaxed, sat back on the boat and watched the grebe. I untangled then properly, put a new fly on and started fishing again. But it was things like that I really realised I'd missed. It wasn't just catching the fish or knowing what to use at the right time, what fly I should have on, what depth I should fish. All those things we go through our heads when we're fly fishing. But I suddenly realised what was going on around me on the water. And I think it's brought it back to me, having had the lockdown, that those things we took for granted, I now realise were part of going fly fishing.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Great fun.
Well, just to tell people who are not aware about your history and your background, I've known you for a number of years now, probably about 25 plus years, when I used to fish Ran Reservoir.
Yep.
And you were the manager?
That's right. Yeah.
Manager there.
Yeah.
And since then, you've done a whole lot of things as well. You've been dealing as an antique.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well,
auctioneer.
Yes, that's right. I ran for years until fairly recently sporting auctions, which was just primarily fishing stuff and shooting. But we also did a lot of fishing memorabilia and shooting memorabilia. I loved it,
Yeah.
And we ran those locally in the end at Llandilo in the Civic Hall. We used to have great crowds there. Great fun. Loved it. But
you were telling me a story earlier on, which we've got to share this, about these reels, which...
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, obviously, when we were in our heyday about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would contact you and say, I've got this box of fishing tackle. It used to belong to Dad.
Yeah.
And you'd think, oh, dear, it's going to be rubbish, But
But
you quite rightly would say, I'll come over and have a look at it. And then you go over and you go through it all with them. And usually wasn't worth anything.
Yeah.
And this chap had left a message from Krakow, I found, my memory serves me well. And all it said was, I found 2 reels in the garage in a box. I think the property belonged to his uncle at the time. And he said, there's 2 reels, fly reels, I think they are, wrapped up in greaseproof paper.
Wow.
And I thought, when I got the message, I thought, that's interesting. And I was busy doing something. And I forgot. And about a week later, my wife said, I've just played the messages. Did you get the one about the 2 reels? Good grief, yes, I better ring the chap up. So I rang him up. Oh, I'm awfully sorry, Mr. Davies. I did ring Phillips in Chester, the auctioneers there, and I explained I had these 2 reels, and their valuer came straight down that day, and a little alarm bell was going. I thought they must have been something interesting. He wouldn't have come down. And I said, oh, that's fine. You've put them in there next auction. Oh, yes. Apparently, the chap said he did the research on them, and they were 2 reels, prototype reels made by Hardy's.
Wow.
And I remember going, really? They were never actually put into production, apparently, but they were genuine Hardy prototype reels, fly reels, alloy reels. And they sold for 58,000 at their next sale. So, great story. Kicked myself for forgetting to get back.
So if anyone leaves messages now, you try to ring them back straight away.
Exactly, Ceri. You can't. But great fun doing the auctions.
You don't do the auctions now, no?
No, we'll do one if we had, say, for example, somebody rang me up and a member of the family had passed away and they had a lot of good fishing tackle.
Yeah.
I'd go and look at it. I had one recently, a chap in Haverfordwest, lovely man, and I think his wife worked for NRW, Natural Resources Wales.
All right, yeah.
And I was asked, could I go and look at Cyril's fishing tackle? Lovely old chap in his 80s. And he'd lost a leg. He was living on his own in Haverfordwest. And I thought, this is an interesting chap. We got talking. And he said, don't I know you? And I looked at him and I said, you might do, Cyril, yeah? No, I set up Rosebush Fly Fishers with Jack Donovan. Good grief, I said, I remember when I leased it out to you. That's right, you were working for, what was then Hyder PLC, but Dŵr Cymru was part of. Yeah. That's right, I remember that. And you and Jack tried to tie me down to very low rates of rent. That's right, we did, but we didn't get far too. And I laughed and I said, no, but we set it up, didn't we? I'm a member now of the same syndicate stroke small club, 25 of us. It's still going. And he said, I know, and I'm so pleased we set that up. And I've got all this tackle. And my daughter, and I realised it was his daughter that worked for NRW then, said I should put it into an auction. And it was lovely stuff. Nothing hugely valuable, Ceri.
Yeah.
But very nice stuff. He tied his own flies. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
But he was you could tell he was what I call, without being snooty, a proper fly fisherman.
Yeah.
You know, he tied imitative patterns for Welsh lakes, particularly wild brown trout. And I said to myself, I've got to sell this for him. And we did, and we sold it very successfully at the auction in Llandilo.
You collect yourself then as well? I noticed you saying you got, was it Isaac Walton's book or something you said?
Yes, well, I've still got a second edition of Isaac Walton's book, so if anybody wants it, give me a ring. It's not going cheap. And it belonged to this gentleman, by the way, and I'd promised I'd sell it for him.
So that's the Complete Angler?
The Complete Angler, yeah. The first edition of obviously the terribly valuable ones, as you know. But put over the air, it's got to be worth £200 to £400 in anybody's money. It's immaculate. So if anybody's interested, you know.
Do you remember, is it Bernard Venables, his name is,
yes,
wasn't it?
Yeah.
He did these little storyboards, didn't he, in the newspapers years ago.
Right, yeah.
And like a father and son, they'd go fishing.
That's it.
Well, he brought out 1 or 2 books, which I've got, actually. And like on their own, they're probably not worth a great deal of money. But I remember you arranged, actually, now it's come to me, for Welsh Water, there was a hotel over by Tintern.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
We used to do auctions there.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name now. Yes, I know where you mean, yeah.
And there was something to do, it was a big launch for something. And who turned up? Who was Bernard Venables?
That's right.
And he must have been 80s or something like that.
He was
then.
indeed, yeah.
And I thought, oh, geez, I wish I had my books now to have him to sign them, you know. Yeah. And the sad thing is, shortly after, he passed away.
He did. That was a meeting, actually, set up by Hamden.
Right.
And we were developing the fishing.
In Wales, yeah.
And he was invited down. Marvellous character, though.
Yeah.
He really was. He was a fascinating man.
And to think that those days, you know, you were looking, I still now and again pick up the book and have a look, and you got these little drawings like a cartoon style storyboard.
Yeah.
You know, and that was your world then.
It was, wasn't
you know, and now people just go on YouTube and just have a look at anybody fishing, like, you know.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I remember, what was it? I forget. Was it Mr. Crabtree Goes Fishing?
Fishing with Mr. Crabtree.
I've got a copy of it.
Yeah.
And as a little boy, of course, I'm older than you, as you know. And then we won't go into that. But as a young boy, I used to love this. I used to look at these pictures, and it would show his son. I think it was called Peter.
That's right, yeah.
And he'd say, Peter, cover that fish. Now drop your fly just upstream and make sure the line doesn't drag, otherwise the fish won't take it. And, you know, the beauty of that kind of stuff, unlike modern technology, enables you and the kids to see it all happening in front of them.
Your mind is working instead of just your eyes.
Your imagination is working, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you haven't got imagination as a fly fisherman, you won't catch fish.
Yeah.
I'm just showing my age, you know that. But too much info clouds the mind. It doesn't give the youngster the ability to think for themselves or to imagine what they would do in that situation. Marvellous books. Really, and beautifully illustrated.
And I think that then in the early days as well, just to be fishing was be out there and to you'd learn things yourself because things weren't easily accessible. How'd you do this? How'd you do that? You'd maybe wait once a month for a magazine to come out. So you learn things yourself, and no, it's just click, it's instant. Yeah,
exactly.
How do I do this?
And I suppose in a way, you know, I'm not like my sons who look at me and they say, Dad, you're no Luddite. can't you use your mobile phone properly? I probably can't.
You got Sheila to do that for you.
Oh, Sheila does it all, yeah. If I look at the computer, it switches itself off, because I just shout at it. But no, joking apart, it's marvellous what they can have today. But again, the one thing that concerns me as a fly fisherman like yourself, so much of fly fishing is imagining what you would do when you're on the river or on the lake or the reservoir, thinking about it. If you're always being shown what to do, it sort of goes into your head and out again. If you've got to think about it a lot more, you're actually going to get really involved in the whole process of fly fishing. And I don't know, Ceri, it concerns me. I suppose as we get older, we become a little bit more cynical.
Yeah, I know.
And we look around, and I think the average age of fly fishermen in the UK now is about 57.
Really?
Yeah, seriously. Wow. How many youngsters are taking it up? You'll hear friends talk about...
Nice to think that I'm below average then.
yeah. You're laughing. But no, if you think about it, the youngsters today, it's all on a plate in a sense, isn't it? And to me, to try and get young girls now fishing, actually, I'll tell you a lovely story about young girls fishing. When my wife ran the tea rooms down at Blackpool Mill on the Eastern Cleddau,
Yeah.
Bluestone, which was just being developed then, the holiday park nearby, the owner was a lovely man, William McNamara, rang me up and he said, Tony, could you do some fly fishing courses for holidaymakers staying with us? I didn't really want to do courses anymore. I was too old. But I said, well, yeah, I could sort of do an introduction to fly fishing. And I'll bring some old rods down, cane rods and old reels, the old alloy reels, my very expensive Hardy Perfect.
Yeah.
I can put them on the table and I can go through to the modern tackle and show them. And then, I'll take them down on the river and we can spend maybe half an hour learning to cast fly rods. So I had plenty of rods. So anyway, we set it up. And you know the interesting thing, Ceri? It was fun doing it. They were fascinated. They were young couples with kids. And most of them brought their wives. The wives wanted to come. And they'd ask me questions about the history of fly fishing, right back to Isaac Walton's day. And then we'd come to the casting. And we'd have, say, 9-foot rod for a 6-weight line. And we'd have 6 of them. And I'd tie on a bit of wool. And made sure, health and safety as it is nowadays, they all had their glasses on. And I demonstrate. Now, I'm not the world's best caster. One of the best casters I've ever known was my old chum Ichtid. I mean, he really was and still is a superb caster. My casting's moderate, it's okay. It enables me to catch fish.
That's what you want.
But I know the rudiments and the basic of casting. So I'd show them. And then they'd all want to have a go. And the guys would take the rod and thrash it backwards and forwards. Far too much physical energy into it. And the cast would be awful. The ladies would listen to you, observe what you told them, and stop the rod at the right angle, wait a split second, push the rod forward, and they were great casters. 9 out of 10 of the wives were better than the guys. And they never came to a repeat class because the husbands would let them. But joking apart, I'd like to see more girls fly fishing. There are more than in my day when I was young, far more. But it is sorry, and I'm sure you see it yourself, more youngsters out in the fresh air, enjoying something, actually, which is physically not hugely demanding, but physically good for you, because fly fishing... you talk to your friends who don't fish, and they've got this image of you sitting on a box by a canal, drowning a maggot or worm. Yeah. But fly fishing involves movement, not just the casting. You might be in the river wading, working your way along the bank. And it's not just that, is it, anymore? It's what's going on around you. Yeah.
Well, fair enough. I was back in 2013, I think it was, or maybe 2014. I was coached for the Welsh ladies team who fishing in Ireland.
Yeah.
And we were struggling to get a team, to be honest then. some members of the team were involved in casting for recovery because
That's right.
because of casting they had cancer.
Yeah.
And
Affects the lymph nodes in the arm.
right,
Apparently,
yeah.
I
And
gather, yeah.
a few of them have got into it because of that. It was just good for their health then, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it'd be nice to see more ladies out there. I think things are changing. I think across the sport, everything now is so they're trying to push ladies into doing things.
Yeah. And I think it's marvellous because, to be fair, fly fishing is far more available now than it used to be certainly when I was a young man and perhaps when you were. There is an awful lot of good advice around, well-written articles in the magazines, as you know. There is, strangely, more fishing available to men and women today than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago, which is great. I think also, you know this, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way about women, certainly not, because modern tackle is light, fly fishing tackle. Can you imagine going salmon fishing in 1890 to 1920s with those enormous 18-foot fly rods?
Yeah.
I mean, the blooming things weighed, I don't know, pounds. Big metal reel, heavy silk lines.
Makes you think what was the build of
exactly.
Georgina Ballantyne.
Yeah, exactly.
Or have a 64-pound salmon. I what the rod was like then.
You've got me going on stories now. Many years ago, I was asked, when I was training as an auctioneer in Hereford, my boss' wife was something to do with the, what do they call it? Ladies, I've forgotten the name. Women's Institute. I'll call it that for now, I forget. Where the ladies all used to meet to discuss things, probably like gardening and sewing.
Yeah.
And he said, Tony, my wife wants you to come and talk about women in fishing. And I sort of unwisely said, oh, yes, sir, I'll do that. I was terrified, Ceri. It dawned on me. I had this formidable lot of ladies. There was 100 of them in the church hall. And I had to talk to these women. Some of them dressed in tweeds. You can imagine the type in those days. And young women in this, when was it? In the early 70s. So I thought my theme would be, who had caught the biggest salmon on a fly? Or shall we say a bait? Because actually, Miss Ballantyne's salmon was caught on I believe, golden dace, which was kept in...
was it a plug or something? Was it?
Yeah, well, it was on a fly rod. It was on a fly rod, but it was a bait with a hook in it, rather like a pike bait. But having said that, I started this talk, you see, and I had up on the screen maps of the famous beats on rivers like the Tweed, the Tay, the Spey. And I said to them, they were all listening, I said, ladies, you'll note that nearest the big house, you walk down the lawn, for example, or you were driven down by the gilly to the home beat. It was called the home beat. There'd be the ladies' pool. Nearly all of them had the ladies' pool. And that was the easiest pool to fish. The river was very amenable in the sense that the flow of the current. So if you did an awful cast, the river would correct the fly line and swing the fly round beautifully over the salmon lies. And these pools were always known as the lady pools for obvious reasons, because that's where they took the ladies, the easiest pools to fish. And you could hear this muttering from the crowd. Typical young bloody man, real chauvinist. Listen to him knocking us. You could feel it from the younger women. So I thought, I've got to be a bit careful here how I go on. So I carried on about the story of these famous beats. And at the end, I said, but let me remind you, who've caught the biggest salmon on a fly? Now, I forget the name of the lady on the Y, but she caught a 58-pound salmon, I believe was the biggest fish caught on the Y, on a fly. Miss Ballantyne, we all know, the daughter of a gilly, on the Tay, the 64-pounder, and there were many other examples. I've forgotten them now. And then some of the young ladies wanted to ask me a question. Hands were going up. Are you saying that women only caught these fish, Tony, because they were put in the best spot, in the easiest place to fish, that men decided they could fish? And I thought, I better be careful here. And I looked at this one young lady and I could see where she was coming from. And I said, no, actually not. And I'll tell you the truth. Yes, they were easily accessible. And we've got to remember, in those days, women tended to wear a lot of clothing, which wasn't conducive to going fishing. They would be walked down to the river with the ghillie and their husband, and they would be able to fish it because it was open and there wouldn't be lots of obstacles. And that's not wrong. That wasn't because the men were being chauvinistic and letting them just fish the best place. They wanted them to fish there. But the real difference between, in my opinion, those women and us men were as follows. When the ghillie showed her how to cast and where to cast, she did it exactly as the ghillie showed her. If it was a man like me, and I'd done it a couple of times, I'll cast the way I normally do. I'm not going to fish that spot. I'm going to fish there. We know better. Women took on board, word for word, demonstrated also by the ghillie, and they copied it. And that's why, in my opinion, they deserved to catch the biggest fish. They were good pupils. And what's happened...
There's something... Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to...
There's something about... I've noticed when I've taken people guiding or tuition, some fellas, they don't really like being told, you should be doing this. Even though they know you know more, they don't want to admit that you do. I remember gillieing on the Corrib. There was this one guy, he wanted to book me for 3 days. Oh, great. And I fished with me and him for the first day. I was suggesting, do this, do that, great. And he was all yours, I'll do it, just to catch the fish, And we had successful 2 days. So much so, and then the third day he said, I'm enjoying this so much, can I bring my wife with me? He was on holidays, he was. So he said, yeah, great. And actually it was her 50th birthday. So this was his treat to her to have a day's fishing with him. And do you know what? He's a different guy in front of his wife. I'd say, do this, now do that. No, I do it like this. He wanted to show that he knew everything,
Yes.
And I was just smiling to myself when this woman on the bow, she was facing me and this guy was in the middle and she was smiling. She could see exactly what was on. He wanted to be the alpha male, didn't he?
Exactly.
And he couldn't. So I was suggesting to his advantage, look, do this now. You're gonna do better. Catch fish. No, I wouldn't want to do that. He said, you want to do it this way. Even bailing the boat, right? There was water in the boat, and I was bailing up. No, you don't want to do. You want to bail the boat this way. And I thought, I've been fishing a boat all my life. But I think the women they like a sponge. They want to be more. They want to learn and take it all in. Don't they
take it in, yes, and they listen. Now it reminds me of another story. I think I've got this right, Ceri. I think it was a well-known, famous ghillie on the Wye called Sammy Males. I think I'm right. My memory. But anyway, he had 2 rods on his boss's beach, you see, 2 industrialists, big fishermen, fished all over the world. And he took them down on the beach and he explained the big pool to them. It was a long pool. And he said, boys, you can see the tree over there on its own. Just under that is a good lie for a salmon. And just beyond there, there's a boulder. And he described where the fish tended to lie in this big pool. And he said, you can rotate, go round. But I don't want you fishing anywhere else. This is the pool you'll get a fish in, on this piece of water, in this weather. It was quite bright. And he obviously knew the river better than anyone else. So that, thanks, Sammy, absolutely no problem. We see what you're saying. And I like the flies. Carry on with the flies you've shown me from your box, he said. And just fish it methodically. Now, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And it'll warm up a bit. The river temperature will rise, because this was early season. Perhaps 0.5 degree. But that'll be enough, maybe, just to bring them on. They both started, well, the first one went in. And he started fishing. Good casters, They were competent fly fishermen, salmon fishermen.
Yeah.
And he went down. And then 20 minutes later, his friend followed him down. And they got to the tail. And one turned to the other and said, God, I didn't touch a fish. Did you see anything? Not in the pool. But do you see those salmon showing in the pool below? I did. Why do you think we can't go and fish there? See? So they fished it again, and they stopped at the bottom. He came through. First one was waiting for him. He said, God, there's some big fish showing in that pool. He's keeping that for somebody else. That's why we're not allowed down there. So he said, you know, you're right. And eventually, Sammy Mills appeared. How are you doing, boys? Oh, we haven't seen a fish in the pool here. Haven't touched a thing, Sammy. But we've seen some lovely fish turning in the pool below. We wondered why we couldn't fish that. Well, this pool's the best taking pool, sir. I promise you. And he was sitting with them, talking. They were having a beer and a sandwich. And Sammy was peeling an orange. He peeled it with his knife. And they watched him, and he took it off. And one of them turned to him and said, well, I suppose you could go down here, Sammy, and land a fish just like that. You could probably catch one on the orange peel. And Sammy looked at him, didn't say anything. Turned to him and said, could I just borrow your rod, sir? Yes. Gave him his rod. Snipped off the fly. Took a hook out of his lapel, salmon hook. Threaded the orange peel onto the hook a certain way. You're going to laugh now, Ceri, but this is meant to be a true story. Waded in just above the tree he told them at the beginning. It was about 11 o'clock. Sun had gone behind a cloud. Rolled the fly out, the orange peel out. Down it came, and twisting and turning, wallop, he was in a fish.
Wow.
Landed this fish. They both said, we must apologise, Sammy. We were being very arrogant. How the hell did you do that? Yeah. Pure luck, sir.
There's anglers and danglers.
Yeah. It's
confidence is a thing, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
That's one thing you got to have, is confidence.
You've got to.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, back to the early days. Well, not so much the early days. When you were working in Llys-y-Fran, obviously you fished for years before that. But when I met you, what involvement, how did you come about working in Llys-y-Fran?
Well, originally I worked, as you know, for Welsh Water, Dŵr Cymru, in the estates department. I was very lucky. Gareth Jones, my boss, nice guy, easy to get on with. And I remember him turning to me one day and he said, when I'd moved down to West Wales from Gwent, he said, Tony, we've got all these leases of small fisheries which aren't economic for Welsh Water to put out to the public.
At that point, what were you doing for Welsh Water then?
Well, I was basically estates officer, did all the claims, compensation claims.
All right.
You know, so if a water main was laid across farmers' land, we would be the valuers that went out with his valuer and assessed the damage and what compensation should be paid.
So getting involved in the fishing side of it was like, yes.
Well, it did suit me, I must be honest. I was very lucky because at that stage, when you mentioned Llys-y-Fran, John Elvid Jones was chairman then of Welsh Water, and it had become PLC, Hyder PLC, probably the largest company in Wales at that stage. So it wasn't just incorporating Welsh Water, it incorporated Swalec, the electricity company, it had its own engineering division, etc., etc. And John Elvid, I always feel, was a man with vision at the time. And he saw, you know, Welsh Water, I don't know, Ceri must own 80-odd reservoirs in Wales. Many of them not fished, of course, smaller ones. But an awful lot of them were very good wild brown trout fisheries, as well as stocked reservoirs. Llys-y-Fran became one of the stocked big ones like Brennig and Llandegford. And John Elvid had contacted me, and he was setting up new companies and staff, and he asked me if I'd be interested in working for Hamden, which was the subsidiary company, with view to managing the fisheries. And of course, you can imagine I jumped at it, didn't I? And that's how I started at Llys-y-Fran.
Right.
And it was at that time we built the visitor centre.
That's incredible, that is.
Yeah,
That's one of the best location visitor centres I've been to.
It was lovely. And actually, at the moment, I understand, or I have nothing to do with it. It's shut now.
Was it lockdown?
No, it was shut because Welsh Water are building a new visitor centre there. They're upgrading the current one.
On the same location?
Yeah, but I believe their concentration now is on a water sports centre. I think we've got to accept as fishermen that, in fairness, many of the reservoirs in England and Wales, from a company's point of view, probably lend themselves better, and I'm talking now about the finances, better as a venue for water sports, canoeing, boating, bike riding around the reservoirs.
More
family orientated, exactly. Yeah. And in some respects, that's a good thing. Now, what I'd like to see, and this is only my view, that the really prime reservoirs, you know, the problem we've got in Wales, other than Allaw in Anglesey and Brennig to a certain degree, although it's high up, they tend to be very deep reservoirs and they fluctuate in level during the summer months a lot. So they're not good fisheries from the point of view of invertebrate life for the trout.
Right.
You know this. I mean, it's put and take fishing, isn't it? So England are very lucky. You've got chew, average depth of chew 18 feet, masses of invertebrate life and small fish in it, coarse fish. So if you stock, and I took on board when I ran Llys of Ran, I took on board the idea that we should get into cage rearing, which I was very pleased about, because at one stage the chairman agreed with me and I set up net cage rearing in Llys of Ran,
and Brennig, is it?
Brennig and Llandegford. It met a lot of opposition from many of my colleagues and also from other people. But if you're going to do it successfully, you have to reduce the input cost of these fish.
Yeah.
Because you know this, I'm not a great believer in having to kill lots of fish. But in the 80s and 90s, reservoir angling was about getting my 6 fish limit.
Yeah.
And they wanted big fish, which was a big mistake. I have an interesting view on this. It may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure of myself. At about mid-90s, there was an influx of cormorants, as you know, to particularly Welsh reservoirs and English reservoirs, causing an awful lot of damage. Now, they were protected, understandably, perhaps for the wrong reasons, but they were protected, and you could very rarely get a license to cull them. And I worked with colleagues of mine in Dŵr Cymru. We had a big conservation wing, and conservation was the big thing in those days. And I understand that. I don't agree with some of the plans for conservation they had.
Yeah.
It was a sort of blanket thing. We're doing this because we want to protect this wildlife. What happened was, I went to a meeting once in work, and I was asked about stocking. And I said, well, we've got major problems on some of the reservoirs with cormorants, killing fish and damaging fish. They don't always kill them. We must look at ways of controlling it. One of my colleagues turned to me and said, well, Tony, put them in bigger. I said, what do you mean bigger? If you put them in over 2 pounds, the cormorants can't swallow them. Well, that's not true, but I could see where he was coming from. And I said, yeah, but this particular gentleman, we won't mention names, I looked at him and I said, who's going to pay to rear on fish to 2 1/4 to 2 3/4 pounds from the normal stocking size of 1 1/4 pounds upwards? The price goes up exponentially after 1.5 pounds. And don't forget, Ceri, you know this, rainbow trout only live to a maximum of 4 years, unlike brownies that can live 18, 20 years. So at that stage, people were looking at bigger fish. And we were a business. We were trying to make a reasonable profit out of our fisheries, like anyone does. There's nothing wrong in that. We weren't greedy, but we still had to run the business successfully. Now, stocking these big fish actually did a lot of damage to the I suppose that's the wrong word. It did damage to why people went fishing on the reservoirs. I've got to get my 6 fish. I've paid 20 quid for this ticket, and I want fish 2.5 pounds. wrong attitude. So anglers got used to catching big rainbow. Since then, the price of fish has remained high and gone higher because pellet feeding is much more expensive to get them to that weight. And many of the private water companies, you know this very well, have looked critically at their reservoirs and said, it isn't worth carrying on with this fishery. We're not making any money out of it. And it is limited to fly fishing in boats only. We should be looking at other ways of exploiting recreational use of the reservoirs for the public.
Yeah. They did open, I don't know what the score is with Lisa Rand now, but they did open one bank, didn't they, or two banks for bait fishing then?
Yeah, well, actually, when I ran it, we inherited a situation there where Lisa Rand had allowed bait worm fishing for the locals. And at that stage, and quite rightly, I think, the chairman and the board felt that many of our reservoirs were very important to local older men in those days.
Yeah.
Excuse the dog barking.
All right.
She's seen a bird on the bird. Elsie, come here. You know, they, like me, were in their 70s and 80s. And it was lovely to get out. They couldn't fly fish. They may have got rheumatoid arthritis, I don't know, or they weren't particularly fit anymore. And as you know, fly fishing, you have to be reasonably fit. So to get out, meet their friends on the bank of the reservoir, drown a few worms.
There was one or two anglers I remember meeting at the time who were fly fishing. And that's how they got into fly fishing, is because they used to go to Llysaran on the bank, fishing the worm, and they could just see the enjoyment on the boat. So,
and they take it up, that's true. But I think there was a social need too, and the board recognised this. Some of our reservoirs, we should retain bait fishing.
Yeah.
I found it as a manager extremely difficult. I got another little story for you. We were cage rearing, as you know, and very successful. Llysaran was fishing extremely well. And my rangers were always telling me, "Toe, we've been keeping an eye on the boys from away. They're hiding fish, taking more than their limit." You always get it, Ceri, you know that, particularly the bait fishermen.
Oh, right.
And so I would say to Dilwyn, the head ranger, and Peter and the others, well, keep an eye out, you know, and you catch anyone, you call me and I'll come down. I then got a phone call from the police. And they said, "Miss Davis, Llysaran, have you had a problem with anyone stealing fish?" "No." I said, "Well, what do you mean?"
The police coming to you?
Yeah, rang me. "What do you mean stealing fish? You mean from the cages?" "Yes." "Oh, no. No.
Oh, from the cages now?
Well, they assumed.
Oh, right,
They hadn't told me why they were asking the question.
Yeah.
And I said, "No, we've not had anyone get out to that cage. It'd be very difficult for anyone to get to the cages, officer." "Why?" "Well, there's a certain pub near you in Johnston." I said, "Yeah." "And we've observed a number of guys getting out of vehicles with black bin liners full of trout, selling them to some chap from Swansea who's paying them cash. And we were trying to work out where on earth are they getting these fish?" And I said, "That's interesting, officer. I think Margot Bateman's got the fish farm down Warriors Reach on the estuary, but they're very secure there. Yeah, we've spoken to them. They've had no problem. And we assumed somebody must be breaking into your reservoir at Llysaran." "Nice trout," he said.
Yeah.
And I said, "I'll make some inquiries." So I got talking to the club, Llysaran Anglers.
Yeah. I was a member there for a few years.
And, oh yes, one of them said, "What we've been doing is we've been getting all the boys with their fish and saying, 'Would you like us to sell your trout? We've got an outlet in Swansea.'" And we all laughed then, because those were the same boys who used to say to me, "God, it's expensive coming here, Tony. God, blimey, paying all this money for 6 fish." You could see the funny side. And unfortunately, it tended to be the bait fishermen that were doing it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I had to raise the season permit price
Yeah.
at the time. But going back to stocking reservoirs, Ceri, as you know, it's a fine art to get it right.
Yeah.
You don't want to encourage, particularly in Wales, where our fish don't naturally grow on, as you know, unless
No.
they just haven't got the feed.
No.
You know, I was talking to one of the boys at Bristol Waterworks, you know, who own Chew and Blagdon.
They can become more residential there
Well,
because there's plenty of feed and over
You've got
winter.
it. They shut down their hatchery there, which was crazy. Perhaps it was costly to run, I don't know. I believe they're running it again now. And in those days, I'm going back a few years, they used to rear on their own rainbow to shall we say, £1.25. And they'd start stocking chew in February, March, April,
Yeah.
quite heavily, with smallish fish, keepable fish, but not big, because anglers hadn't got used to these big fish then.
Yeah.
But you and I know they would also, I used to fish there when I was in Bristol. Anglers would go early in the season to get the overwintered rainbow and brownies in spring, April time. And they'd catch these recent stockies and probably slip them back in those days, let them go, try and get a bigger fish. But if you went and caught one of those £1.25 rainbows in June, it was now £2.5 because it had fed naturally. Chew was stuffed with feed,
Yeah.
so they would put on weight. So the difficulty for fishery managers in Wales is getting a balance right.
Yeah. I suppose with stocking as well, one thing I noticed, I used to do an awful lot of competition fishing.
Yeah.
And what I used to find was, obviously, the reservoirs, the fisheries, they want to promote it to get more anglers there. And I got a little bit tired of the competition scene purely because what was happening, you'd go to a venue, maybe Llandegfydd, for instance, and they want to see good results. So the reservoir now would be full of fish.
Yeah.
The day before, 2 days before,
Stock
you
it.
put 500 fish, 1,000 fish, whatever. So, you know, for maybe 100 anglers, is going to be like 800 fish caught, and people are going to think, wow, let's go
Got
and
to go and
fish
have
there.
a ticket there. Absolutely
But
right.
it made the competition fishing just a total farce then,
Yeah,
you know.
it did.
So-
well, you're dead right about that. I had long discussions with my colleagues about this. And we brought in a regime of trying not to stock heavily before a major trials or international.
Yeah.
I ran a lot of them. And what we did, we started it at Llanelli because we had the cages. Dilwyn, my head ranger in those days, and the boys that took over from him were all fishermen, thank God. And they understood what was needed. So we stocked gradually in the punt. We would take 500 fish right up one arm of the reservoir, releasing them slowly. But rainbow especially stock rainbow, have a habit of shoaling.
Yeah.
And the danger with, as you rightly say, with competitions, these guys were past masters at
Sitting
understanding.
on the fish then.
Yeah, well, they'd follow into a bay and they'd circle the bay, these fish, because you'd suddenly see all the boats aim for one bay
Yeah.
because the wind was, say, in the west, and fish would go with the wind, stockies, not into it necessarily. And they'd circle round and round. So boat one would be catching them on the left-hand side of the bay. They'd get one fish each, then the fish would move on, and you'd see them being caught on the other side of the bay. So
Yeah.
you used to try and find ways of combating this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the key to it was, and I used to have big arguments, dear old Mock, you remember Mock Morgan used to run them very capably, Worcester. And we used to talk about this, and I said, what bothers me, Mock, is having fish competitions myself too, as you know, like yourself. Our boys are too used to catching tame fish. So when they go to Ireland or Scotland, you know what I'm going to say, don't you?
Yeah.
In those days, they didn't get anywhere in the competitions because the Irish and the English, who were very good at learning,
Yes.
they were fishing the right methods for these trout, not stripping lures, if I can put it like that, you know,
Yeah,
to catch
yeah.
stockies. No, I agree with you. Competition fishing, up to a point, is a young man's sport anyway. I don't enjoy it.
Yeah.
Certainly not now.
I probably packed her in about 10 years ago. I've done it a few since, But I far prefer just a competition now between me and a wild trout, you know.
Quite, yeah.
So how did you start? When did it all start for you fly fishing then?
I'm sure, like yourself, I mean, my dad was a mad keen fisherman.
Was he a doctor or something?
Yeah, he
you
was a
said?
doctor. I mean,
Yeah.
he'd come back to Wales. My dad was Welsh speaking. My mum was English from Norfolk. And they moved back. He ran a practice. He was the old Dr. Finlay type.
Yeah.
You know, he would go out and see his patients. When we were kids, we very rarely saw my dad. The phone would ring. My mother was an unpaid telephonist in those days.
Yeah.
And he'd be off to the farms in the middle of the night. But he loved fishing. It was
Where was this then?
Aberdyfi and Tywyn.
That's what you were brought up
Yeah,
with,
that's
is it?
where I was brought.
Right.
And I was very lucky. And my father taught me. He was one of the best casters I've ever seen. You know, I go back now and he used cane rods.
Wow.
And as a little boy, Mum would say, I was one of 6 kids. I was the eldest boy, 3 boys and 3 girls. And he would take me, on his farm was on the estuary of the Dyfi, high up near Dyfi Junction, the railway. And Gwynant, lovely man, was the farmer there. And Dad could fish the tidal piece. And you know the local club own it. And New Dyfi Fisheries, most of the river, was left to them. And they run it really successfully, very well. But Dad could fish this private bit. And as a little boy, we'd have to walk for half a mile along the river embankment to the Drynock Pool or whatever it was called, I forget. And he would carry 2 rods, Ceri, in those days, 2 cane rods. One would be 10 foot and one would be 8'6". I remember that. Kingfisher lines, silk lines on the reels.
Silk line, yeah.
And he would wade in the lovely old black Dunlop thigh waders in those days. And he'd wade in at the tail of the pool in the evening. The tide was out, of course. And I can still see it. You'd see a lot of midge floating down the river. It'd be flat calm. And dimples, fish coming up all over the place, sucking them in.
Would he be fishing for trout then?
No, this is honestly true. My father would then turn to me and he'd say, there were lots of little ditches and streams running in. So I go off and play in them, catching the minnows. I was bored. I didn't want to watch my dad fishing. He'd wade out. And he'd have the big rod, which used to have in those days, I remember it, on the gut cast. I think it was the start of nylon, you know, for casts. But gut cast and kingfisher line, which had to soak in the water to sink, if you wanted it to sink.
Yeah.
You'd have a haslam on, which was a famous Dyfi fly.
Haslam, yeah.
Do you remember it?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there were 2, if my memory serves me well, beautiful fly. It had a Palmer body over silver, and I think from memory, probably a hen pheasant wing, or maybe a bronze mallard, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But it used to have 2 ibis feather slips on either 2 horns, basically, running down the flank, each side of the wing.
Yeah.
And I think the female was red, 2 slips of red, and the male were blue slips.
Right.
I'll never forget them. And I say, Dad, I'll let it soak. Now, so we say, for the sake of argument, he started at 7:30 in the evening, and the tide wouldn't be in there until 11:30. So he'd fish then. And he'd go in with his little 8'6" rod. He's a very good caster. Fish delicately. Can you believe this, Ceri? He'd be fishing with a size 16 or 14 black pennel dry.
Yeah.
Dry. Cockhackles. Stiff.
Yeah.
Right? And he'd be catching suin from £0.5 pound up to 2.5 pounds.
In daylight still.
In daylight, yeah. I mean, this was... When the light was going, he would then come ashore, put that rod away. Where's my rod? And I'd show it with the line pulled off the reel, soaking in the stream.
Yeah.
Good boy. And he'd take that out, and he'd wade deeper as the light started to go. And then he may catch 3 or 4, what we would call big suin, 4 to 6 pound.
Really?
And he was doing this. And the best of it was, and this is what sticks in my brain, he'd turn to me and he'd have 2 Hessian sacks tied up in his fishing bag. And he'd open one and drop. And he kept everything in those days, bar the small ones. He'd put 20 odd suin in the one bag, 20 small fish, right? And in the other, 3 or 4 of the bigger fish he caught later. And then he'd tie the string around the top.
Or like a keep net.
No.
Oh, they were dead?
Dead, oh yeah, to take home.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I'll tell you why. It wasn't greedy. They all did it in those days. But my dad would say, right, boy, you start dragging that bag along the river embankment towards the car. The car was half a mile away. Yeah. I was 8 years old. And he'd set off with the bag with the big fish in and his fishing tackle ahead of me. And then he'd come back to find me. I was petrified. It was going dark. And I was dragging this bag with all these suin in, being bitten to death by midges. You never forget these things. No. And then the next morning, for example, he'd be in his surgery in Abu Dhabi, and they'd be in there and say, Mrs. Joan Nanty-Essin would be there to see him. And in Welsh now, they'd be talking together, and he'd be going through her records, and he'd say, you need to eat decent diet of fish, dear. And he'd turn round to the sink in the surgery and give her 2 suin. And he'd give them to his patients. And
there'd be a queue every time.
Went fishing. People used to say, did they really need to see you about medical things, Tom? But he did that with the aim of giving them fresh fish. Yeah, we ate sea trout regularly. Yeah. And my dad got very upset. Uncle Billy, who was the local optician in Abu Dhabi, was a great fly fisherman. Tied the most beautiful flies. I mean, they really were classic. Small.
Have you got some of his flies still?
Yes, still got them in a box. I never use them. I just keep them.
Oh, that's
names,
nice.
But he and Dad used to fish Big Island, we talked about.
Yeah.
Very lucky.
Above Tallaghyn, is it?
No, you go through Mahanclith, and then you take the Stay Little Road over the top, we used to say. You come down at Clwedog, basically.
Right, yeah.
Clwedog's fishing well now.
Yeah.
It's very well run.
Oh, unbelievable. The amount of stuff I've been a few times there and been on the nets. And
Oh, the boys there.
There's more fish than water in there.
Yeah, well, you're right. But interestingly, I gave a talk to them years ago about cage rearing. And I remember one of the Llanidloes Fly Fisher committee saying to me, we couldn't afford to set up cages, Tony, the club, because they were leasing it from Severn Trent. And I said, well, perhaps you could get a sports grant. And I think they got a grant. Mock and I talked about it. Right. I put a letter in as well, and they got a grant. And that's where they started. But as you know, I go up there quite regularly with a friend of mine from Pembrokeshire. And I know, just shows my age, Ceri, because one of the lads who's there, Gareth, right, big strong lad now in his 30s with a family of his own.
Yeah.
I remember him as a 10-year-old coming beating on Dad's little shoot on his farm.
Well, him and Russell
Owen,
they play a big part.
Russell, to be fair to them, Russell and the boys have really brought that. It's one of the best still water reservoirs in England and Wales.
Oh, no question, as far as I know.
You know that. I mean, it really is.
I had a couple of outings there last year and year before. And one of the days, Russell said, do you want to come on to the nets to have a look,
Yeah.
So I go on to the nets and he was feeding them. And then all of a sudden, I just happened to see a flash outside the net below me. And my mouth was aghast. This fish is got to be 20 pounds,
Yes, I know.
And then I tell him, Russ, I said, there was a fish there. He said, watch this, he said. And he just threw a handful of pellets outside of the nets. Yes. See them down, and right, there must have been 20 or 30 of them. Yeah. Same sort of size, So there must have been, again, like about 20, 30 of these high-end double-figure rainbows. Yeah. And the tails of them,
super.
They look like, because they're out in the open, they're not in a net, they look like steelheads almost, And but they don't travel far away from there. No. You might get one, I think it's Eblid it is, and there's a couple of places where they do, for some reason, go to and they get caught. Yeah. But the majority of them stay there.
They stay by the cages, they go back. Which is,
Did you get them in Lisaran like that?
Yes, yeah. I used to go out with the boys onto the cages myself, when they were feeding.
Yeah.
Because I think they're using automatic feeders a lot on Clwedog, which is a good thing.
Yes.
It's progressed now. But what's interesting to me, talking to Russell and Gareth particularly, they're very fussy about how they feed their fish, what quantities, and the stocking rates per cage, because fin erosion on stockies has always been the bane of us fly fishermen. It's got no tail,
Yeah.
But it's usually due to the fish farm having too many fish in a confined area.
Yeah.
And what happens is they do nip each other. They get into a feeding frenzy. I used to have fun,
They do grow back in time, do they? A little. Do they?
Oh, well, I'm no expert, but yes, they do. I mean, it depends on their age.
Yeah.
I mean,
they don't grow, the majority of them, I suppose, once they stock, they don't really grow that length of time.
You've got to remember, for a rainbow to be sort of 8 pounds upwards stocked, it's going to be at least 2.5, 3 years old. It's getting near the end of its life.
Yeah.
This is why when I referred to chew, putting them in at £1.25 pounds, that's a fish year plus old. There's plenty of growth in that fish. And if it adapts then to natural feeding, that's why you and I and most of our friends who fish say, oh, you've got to go to Draycott and catch one of those overwintered rainbow.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, aren't they? And to me and you, I suppose now, I prefer to fish for wild brownies. It's all relative.
Yeah.
I talk to people and they say, there's nothing moving when they're on, say, Rosebush or Beguilin or Gogear or even Tinnaconn or Talchlyn, which sadly has gone down, as you know, because of the weed growth. Modern farming has ruined that.
Yeah.
Too much fertilizer going into the lake. But they say, there's nothing moving because they're used to fishing for rainbow. And I say, look, wild brownies, 90% of the time, will be feeding with their head down and their tail up on the bottom. If there's a good hatch, and when do you normally get hatches, boys? Late evening. You've gone home for supper.
Yeah.
You're fishing through the day. Now,
and it's always a case of a dirty day. You get a dark day, a good blow. That's when you're likely to get the good browns. Yeah.
They come into the shallows.
Yeah.
I always say to guys fishing, if you're drifting, remember, what do you think the shadow of a boat is to a fish in 3 foot of water? He's off for the deep water, isn't he?
Yeah.
It's a threat, Think about your fishing. Think about where you're fishing and why you're fishing there. Yeah. When somebody arrives at a reservoir and says, where should I go? Well, the rangers are always helpful. Oh, the best arm is so-and-so arm. And you go there without thinking.
Yeah.
You don't start to think, why is it the best arm? Why are the fish there? And that's the beauty of fly fishing. We never know it all, Ceri, do we? We think we do. You're not my age.
Do you know what? There's loads of stories. I know when you were ahead, I want to get out, right? And we could talk all day.
Yeah.
But there's something you touched on. What I remember you telling me stories the last time, that your brother is in South Africa.
That's right, yeah.
And the fly fishing you've experienced there is something else in the lakes, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they call everything out there, every reservoir, a dam.
Yeah.
And most of the dams were built primarily for water irrigation and water for the livestock.
Yeah.
And Martin, my brother's in Grahamstown, in Eastern Cape, on the Winterberg Mountains. And he's a fishery scientist. He went out there from university and stayed, basically, at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. And he's retired now. He's fanatical. He'd drive you nuts. He never stops talking
Just
about
running
fish.
the family.
Yeah, yes. I mean, he wakes up in the night and he's talking fish in his sleep.
Did he used to go fishing with you and your dad?
Oh, yes, yeah. And a good fisherman, very observant. But Mark used to say to me, he's got 2 hatcheries out there.
Wow.
And I hasten to add, I'm not very pleased at the moment with the way Natural Resources Wales are looking after our fisheries. I'm sure you're not. They will come up with plenty of excuses, funding, staffing levels. I mean, there's no bailiffs now. They've changed the role.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember back in the 90s, Tony Bevan. Do you remember Tony Bevan? Great fisherman.
A few times, yeah.
Superb hard worker, Tony. All his colleagues, Emir Lewis.
Yeah.
I knew them all. Lovely guys. Work all hours to protect the rivers. I think we've only got one down here now.
Bailiff.
Peter Kirkup. Lovely guy, does his job very well, but he has other roles to play now for NRW. But the problem is the rivers are suffering from over-exploitation at sea, in the estuary. We have a problem now with, shall we put it nicely, cormorants. Nothing wrong with the cormorant, but I suppose an awful lot of young fish are killed now by birds like cormorants, goosanders, which have multiplied in the last 25 years. It's a difficult balance to strike. You know, to be fishing for wild fish, suin. I mean, our rivers down here were the best in Britain. When I fished in the world team years ago in Jackson Hole in Wyoming, the lady who was guiding the Welsh team, I think it was Edie Gangwer, her name. She was lovely. God, she could cast, Ceri. She embarrassed all of us. She was only about 5'4", but you watched her cast a fly rod on those rivers, you were embarrassed. Lovely woman, but she had us all round for drinks one night. You know, the Welsh team, and Mock was there, his wife, and Howell. And we were chatting. And one of the friends turned to me and said, Tony, in Wales, you've got, what do you call them there? What's the word? Suin. They're called peel, hurling, other names, sea trout.
Yeah.
God, yeah. But you fish at night. And he was a very competent fly fisherman, this guy. You know, he'd fished all over the world. But he'd never fished at night. And, of course, I got into my stride, you know me. I waffled on for hours describing how marvellous night fishing was with a fly and the total anticipation of takes. You did everything by feel and judgment. You couldn't see much. And when that line suddenly darted through your fingers and you lifted in, you didn't know if it was a pound suin or an 8-pound suin until it took off. And he was...
His senses
yeah, that's right. And he was absolutely engrossed in this. Now, I used to talk with Mock, Gareth Edwards, our chairman, you know, big fisherman, Gareth, about what we had that was special here in Wales for fly fishermen. And it was night fishing, the Dovey, the Tivy, the Towie, the Cothi, and on, my little river, the Eastern Cleddau. This was a unique sport, really, Ceri, wasn't it? It was done a bit in Devon and Cornwall. The Scots didn't bother.
There's a romanticism about it as well. You know, if even people were coming away to fish it, the experience is something
tremendous. You know? But I think also it was something, I'm being a little mercenary now, it was something we should have exploited more for tourism. Because I used to go around B&Bs at one stage when I ran river to river with Ichted. And many of the ladies who ran these B&Bs were asking me, well, what do these night fishermen want? So it was different. Well, I'll tell you now, give them a key, because they're not going to go out until about 9:30. They're not going to start fishing till 10:30. And they're going to come back at 5 o'clock in the morning. And they don't want you waking them up for breakfast at 8 o'clock.
That's true.
And they go, oh, you've got to resurrect a different policy for treating these people. They'll pay good money. You look after them, a nice hearty breakfast at 10:30 in the morning. And maybe they'll go off then in the daytime, perhaps go around the shop, spend some money locally. I used to have many of them come down. So to me, we've lost a lot of that due to the fact that these rivers now are not producing the fish they used to 5-10 years ago. My own little river here, I mean, old people like me talk like this. The good old days, we're a bit nostalgic, aren't we?
Yeah.
But I'm a little bit more realistic. There is a major problem. And I said earlier to you, 2 of my friends farm. They're big dairy farmers down here. And they both accept what dairy farming's doing.
So the key is the pollution, do you think, then?
I think it is, to a large degree, there are problems at sea. I've never understood why NRW appears to be unable to maintain or control netting. And I'm talking licensed nets, not illegal nets. I mean, I can walk into the local town here, Narberth, which is a shop which sells fish, and I know the boys there. and they have people coming in asking for suin for a meal.
Yeah.
And they're paying, are you ready for this? $29.95 a kilo for fresh suin. So
right?
that, yes. But when the word goes out that you can get nearly 30 quid a kilo for a fresh suin, then the boys who aren't bothering to poach, right? Because they say there's not many fish, it's not worth it. They think, I only need 2 of those and I can sell them. So it is an issue. There's been a great change in the way they manage. Bailiffs used to have their own dogs, trained Alsatians. Not allowed to now, health and safety, too risky. And I'll tell you truthfully, and I've been in management, the real problem with these organisations like NRW is they're risk averse. Because back, I forget which government, brought in corporate liability to the public sector as well as the private sector. So senior management then becomes personally the people in charge responsible. So they avoid situations that may give rise. And that's being a little cynical, and maybe they'd say that's very unfair, but I'm not convinced of that. It makes them feel we've got to avoid getting into situations where it's high risk. And unfortunately, these rivers have suffered. Mainly, it's not their fault. I take issue with the current government in Wales over the management of dairy farming. Don't forget, as I told you earlier, I was a trained auctioneer and valuer by Russell Bourne and Bright, one of the biggest firms of auctioneers in Herefordshire. I sold cattle, sheep, grass keep. So I have a rudimentary understanding, but modern dairy farming is now industrialized. You know as well as me, around here, now they will cut the fields 4 to 6 times in one season. No invertebrate living in that environment will survive. Its life cycle can't go through in that period with all the grass cutting. And then they smother the ground in slurry. It is a big issue. And I'm hoping, probably like you, some good will come out of this coronavirus and the lockdown.
I think it does,
I think people are beginning to think now.
Realise what they had and what they better look after.
Let's look after honestly, I mean this sincerely, Ceri, from a selfish point of view, because it'll protect our rivers. If the farms don't have to be bigger and bigger and bigger all the time to make more money, because the cost of farming, you talk to the farmers like my friends, these tractors are 125,000 each. A forage harvester, $500,000. And they're all contractors now. The farmers don't buy them. So the pressure's on the contractor to be out 24 hours. I live in rural Pembrokeshire. If you were here a fortnight ago, we couldn't talk now. They were coming up and down this road from 3 different cutting sessions, one after another with 20-ton trailers on. That's a problem, and it affects the rivers. And if we went back to a system, and that's up to government, to look critically at how do you sustain a young farmer and his family making a reasonable living on a 200-acre farm, say in Pembrokeshire or Ceredigion. We've got to find we've got to find a way, because they are, at the end, the future of rural communities, those farms. But what's happening now, you're getting farming companies buying up. So they're 2,000 acres, right? And they bring in a young lad or girl who's been to agricultural college, and they don't want to go out in the morning. They want to sit in a room with computer screens. The cows are milked by robots. They have contractors in to service them. Dangerous way to go, in my view. If we can find a way of allowing people to make a living on a reasonable acreage of land, and it's not going to be easy. You're going to have a lot of lateral thinking, and the government is too. You and I, in our real old age, will still be able to go fishing on the rivers.
That would be nice.
It would be.
Going on to the fishing and what you want to do then. Are there any goals you've got or anywhere on your bucket list you want to do some fishing?
Well, funny you should raise
We touched on South Africa, and I don't know how we went off on a tangent.
We did.
But
I always
anywhere
do
else? Is it anywhere you'd want to go?
Yes. I'll tell you now, a great friend of mine, Jay, rang me up, this was about 12 months ago, and we're both at the same age. And he said, "To, how about coming to Alaska? Salmon, rainbow, wild rainbow, of course, grayling, superb." And he said, "Do you fancy coming?" And when we worked out the price, I went, "I think my wife may have something to say about that." But to be fair, I planned to go originally, and then I couldn't. And he was going because he actually rang me.
And did he go then?
I don't know. I haven't spoken. He was due now in July.
Is it?
Yeah, I must give him a ring. I was afraid to ring because if he was at home, I know he hadn't gone and he'd be miserable. But I suspect they won't have gone because of the, the coronavirus, which is sad. So yes, where I'd love to go, and you probably would feel the same. I'd like to go to British Columbia and Vancouver Island. I've got a great friend out there, and Jay has as well, the chum I was telling you, and fish there for steelhead.
Yeah.
The Americans, I'm sure you know this, Ceri, they've got major problems with their king salmon. As you know, they're losing them. But they all want to catch a large steelhead on the fly. They don't have to fish, I'm told, on many of these rivers with tweeny lines, leg core lines. Boring to me. They can fish an intermediate line for steelheads. And it's one fish, See, it's like our suin. It's a seagoing rainbow. They strip the reel. I think getting old, I'd probably pass out or have a heart attack and die happy on the river. But, they fight to the last bit.
I think I'd love to do that. Yeah, I think that would be a good draw for me too. I think I've always preferred that the game side of the steelhead, the salmon, the sea trout to the trout. Then a lot of people have got this bonefish addiction. I mean, saltwater. I've done a little saltwater fishing on you actually, and I've had the bass and the mullet and pollock even. I've fished pollock £5, and it's good sport, but there's no draw there really. It's just something different. Yeah, but I'd fancy a sea trout.
I agree with you. I've done it here like yourself. I mean, on our stretch down here, it's tidal, bottom end of the beat, as you know, and I've taken rods there, and I've taken them fly fishing for bass, and they look at me as though I'm a bit strange. But Tony, we're in a field. They think they're going to be on the estuary, And the Dyclether estuary is a very long estuary. You've got the eastern and the western rivers coming together to form it. But the tide comes up miles to Blackpool Mill, and we
fished it. Actually, I remembered.
You came
with
me,
a couple
didn't you?
of £1.50. I remember, right?
Well, not being pig-headed about it, I've had them on the fly, £7.5, £8.
Well, on the river?
On the river.
Wow.
But when I take these guys, it's priceless. And these are good fishermen, know more, frankly, about sea fishing with the fly than I do. And they look at me and they say, "Why am I paying this bloody Tony Davies to go on a river for bass?" And I say, "This is tidal, boys." And it's only, 10 yards wide where they're standing with me? And I look at them and I say, "No, the tide is creeping up. It hasn't got here yet. I want you to duck down in these nettles or the Himalayan balsam on the side of the river. Keep absolutely still as though you're stalking wild brown trout." And they look at me and go, "Right, what's going to happen?" Well, the first thing you'll see coming off the front of the tide, you'll see the tide coming up towards you, a mullet. Big mullet. We've caught those as well.
Yeah.
Amongst them, if you're lucky, no guarantees, will be a few bass, predatory bass. But they will the mullet will swim lazily up the middle. The bass will be coming up the edges looking for food.
Do they?
Yeah. And when you cast, and they're listening now because these are fishermen, when you cast, don't cast just in front of him, you'll spook him, he'll be gone. Cast 10 yards above him. And you've got a sink tip on, and the reason for that is you want to pull your fly down and hold it there.
Yeah.
And as he comes forward, watch the fish and twitch your fly and see a bass will signal that he's seen it, you'll see his fins go, woof, and he'll almost stop, and then he'll power in for your
Really?
fly. Yeah. Not always, but you know he's a taker. Yeah. Sometimes he'll ignore you. And I've caught them on all sorts of patterns, you know.
Up to £7.
Yeah, on the fly. Caught them 9.5 on a spinner.
Yeah.
But we, again, sadly, we haven't got the numbers we used to have.
Yeah.
You know, and again, commercial fishing is a major problem for us. Bass are expensive. There are boats out here. Jigging is the big thing now. They jig. Yeah. And they'll catch 80 bass in a trip. Yeah. Okay, most of the boys are good. They'll put back the shoalies, but they'll be keeping 30 fish, £2 plus upwards.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that. I don't think government is aware what a valuable asset we're losing. We talked earlier about tourism, didn't we? And you get far more money out of the tourist angler than you do out of a few netsmen. I'm a valuer. Let me just tell you a few facts of life. When you ask NRW how they value a license to seine net or coracle, they go quiet. They don't use valuation principle. You'll get the experts telling you, supposed experts in NRW, the legal department, we can't control netting, you know. They've got these special rights and the law would have to be changed and bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. You can alter it. You know, this season now, we're not allowed to keep a salmon, quite right. They've limited the tackle you can use on our rivers, as you know. Single hook, for example, on a spinner. All methods to reduce the kill of fish. Nets, coracles, seine nets, compass nets, reduce the season by 1 month. And I raised it at a meeting. I said, why couldn't you have said under the bylaws, due to the lack of fish, to have cut them back to 1 month fishing with the nets? Oh, we can't do that, Tony. And the problem is there, in a nutshell, is the inability, either because they don't want to do it, or, to be fair to them, they can't do it legally. And I would be saying, well, we'll find a way around the legal problem, right? If we have to change the law, because you cannot sustain netting. And I offered, amongst some friends of mine, Ceri, at one meeting, I said, look, I'm a retired old boy, but I know my river well, and my friends do. Now, we will act as your eyes and ears, because you haven't got the staff anymore. You haven't got the bailiffs. We're quite happy to be trained. We'll contact you, and you'll know when we ring you there is a problem, because we know what to look for and where the nets operate. So unlike Joe Soap, the public ringing you up and saying, I've seen 2 men going down netting. Where, sir? And then a bailiff eventually goes there and finds that they're a licensed net. We know what are not licensed nets or hobby netsmen on this estuary. And we will be happy to do that for you, unpaid, provided you give us the kit to wear and the authority to do it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. Now, to me, that's the kind of thing that's going to have to happen in the next 5 years to protect the dwindling stocks.
Or it'll be some sort of like vigilante group.
Well,
yes. Just taking it in their own hands. If they can see you're buying your license, they're not seeing any advantage in paying for your license, and so they think they might as well do it themselves.
You know, I mean, NRW and the Environment Agency in England will tell you, with some justification, they will show you how they spend the license fee we pay.
I can imagine if they listen to this now, you might have a telephone call saying, could be our consultant?
Well, no, probably ask me not to libel them or slander them. You know. But in fairness, it's difficult for them. I understand that. But if there's a will, there's a way. You and I know that. I wonder whether the pressures on the rivers in Wales for other usage, canoeing, what do they call it, Ceri? This funny swimming wild swimming where they jump in the river and pop up like a cork.
Yeah.
All these things, we want to be able to walk on the river with our dogs. You know.
I gotta hold a sec. There's that. What's that noise? Helicopter.
No, shut the door. He's mowing the grass across the way.
There's lots and lots of more things I got notes here to ask you. When the time goes so quick, I mean, like, and the stories you come out with.
Well, I talk too much, you know that.
There's so much in that head. I want to maybe come back and get some more stories from you. Because when I started the idea of doing this podcasting channel, you were top of the list because I thought you're full of stories, you know, and you're enthusiastic about it. And I can see by the way you're talking about the rivers, your passion, you want to get them back how they were. I think before I wrap it up now, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and Elsie here, I'm stroking Elsie as she's sitting alongside me. One thing I ask everyone at the end is, where would you be for your last cast?
Do you know, Ceri, that is a good question. I think it would be on Beguiling, underneath Plynlimmon, which is one of the few naturally wild lakes, a bit like Tivy Pools.
Yeah.
Tivy Pools. That's where I'd like to be. I'd like to be there in May because they still have the claret dun because the water's not polluted. It's all heather and moor. So there's no farming up there, only sheep on the fields. On the land. Absolute paradise for wild brownies. Yeah. My memory is not working so well, but I fished it years ago with Emma Lewis, one of the Welsh water bailiffs, great fisherman, Emma. And I'd been reading, I think it's Harris's book on the fly fisherman's entomology. It was written in the 50s. It was the forerunner of, he took the first colour photographs, plates of insects, and he related the fly life to patterns to use. And I was reading this book, it was my dad's, and the nymph is with claret with a gold rib, and I forget the hackle. I think I'm right, it would have a very sparse bronze mallard fibres and a tail the same. And Emir, and I'll finish on this one, was sitting in the boat and they suddenly started rising. Now we'll have some fish tow. And he's a good fisherman and he was getting fish. I was getting 2 to every one of his and he didn't like it. I was only about 18 at the time. What are you using? And I showed him. Good God, what's that? He said, I've never seen one like that. Now the nearest wet fly equivalent would be, do you know the fly, the cochenlass? It's the heather fly. And it's got a red hackle, throat hackle, black body with a silver rib, and a mallard wing feather. Maytime on Beguiling as it used to be.
On a drifting boat? On
a drifting boat, yeah. I would go back there. It's where I started. It's full circle. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, that's lovely.
It's how it works. I still come back to Wales.
Well, I hope we'll get a chance to have a boat together sometime again. Maybe on Rosebush.
We will. Definitely. You'll have to fish. And may I wish you all the very best with your project.
Thanks very much.
Good luck.
And thank you for inviting me down to your home.
Pleasure. Nice to see you.
Tight lines. See
and the same to you, Ceri.
Cheers, Tony.
Cheers, bye.
If this is your first time tuning in, make sure you catch all future episodes by clicking subscribe via the links on my website, castingwithcerijones.com, or via iTunes or your favourite podcatcher. If you like what you've heard on this episode, feel free to drop me a line via my website. Tell me what you've enjoyed, ask a question, or better yet, tell me what you want to hear more of in the future. And if you're looking for additional tips, tackle reviews or venue information, or just want to see what's been hit in the back of my net lately, search up Casting with Ceri Jones on Facebook or follow me on Instagram. And if you still want more, I'm regularly uploading video content onto the Casting with Ceri Jones YouTube channel, so just check that out and subscribe over there too. Wherever you follow, subscribe, comment or message, I look forward to catching up soon for a good fishing chat. Well, I think that's all for now, so until next time, tight lines and don't strike too soon.